Welcome, everyone. Before I get started, I want to tell you that I am not a big biblical scholar. I do not have a seminary degree. I guess I am a scholar, but I don't have a degree, and I'm not a person of renown. I am, however, born again, a son of the Most High God, born again through Jesus Christ. And I feel that he put this topic on my mind and that I'm going to teach it. And the reason that I feel like I had to make that disclaimer is that you will find some very educated biblical scholars that will present a different viewpoint on what I'm going to be teaching today. And so I want you to recognize that someday you will stand before the throne of God all by yourself, and that it's not the time to throw somebody else under the bus and say, well, so-and-so said this, and that's why I did what I did, or I thought what I thought. You need to be able to own it for yourself. And that's the encouragement I want to give you today. Now, I'm going to tell you that my journey with the Bible, first, I listened to a bunch of teachings by a bunch of people. I read a bunch of books. I thank God for these people that have had the heart and applied themselves so diligently and were able to produce the kind of information that really helped me get started on my path. But at some point, you really got to own the relationship and go all in. I was going to read the Bible cover to cover, and I did. And I'll tell you, the first time through it, there were sections that I hit where I was just like, I don't know what this means. But my goal was to finish it, and I just kept reading. I just kept reading, even though I didn't get it at all. Then I decided to read it a second time. The second time, I chose a second version. And you know what? I started to get a feel for the framework. I started to recognize a little bit of the foundation, the bones, so to speak. It started to make more sense. Then I went in a third time. The third time I was using the REV, and that there was some commentary, but it wasn't really very full yet. You know, it's a progressive work. It continues to get better all the time, but it was just at an earlier point in time. And so if I would get to a point that I didn't understand, I would go to an earlier version of a Bible that had commentary. And if that didn't help clarify things for me, I went to a newer version of the Bible and read their commentary. And if with those three sources I didn't get it, then I would move on. So now I'm into the fourth time, and this is like, I am not letting it go. No, I'm just not letting it go. When I see something that I don't get, I'm making a note of it. And the REV Bible is kind of cool because you'll see a section called My REV if you get to digging in it, and it lets you put your own notes in there. So I will dig diligently until I feel like I've exhausted, as much as I can do. And then I will mark it. I'll make a note and I'll say, I have a question and this is what my question is. So with all of that said, now we can get started. And I do have a presentation to share, so I will bring that up. All right, so I'm reading through the Bible, and I get to this verse, Exodus 23:19, and it says, the best of the first fruits of your ground you are to bring into the house of Yahweh your God. You must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And I thought, oh my gosh, what does that mean? And I thought, maybe the scribe sneezed and, it was just permanent ink on there or something like that. And that can't really be what it says. But then I got to Exodus 34:26. You are to bring the first of the first fruits of your ground to the house of Yahweh your God. You must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay, one scribe sneeze, maybe. I don't think it's happening twice. And God does protect his word. So if the scribe sneezed, I'm sure he would have corrected it anyway. And if that wasn't enough, Deuteronomy 14:21. You are not to eat of anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the foreigner living among you who is inside your gates so that he can eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to Yahweh your God. You must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, at this point, I really had to, figure out what was going on with this thing. And I looked at some different commentaries. I started, of course, with the REV. And it only had commentary on the Exodus 23:19 note. And I put the commentary in here, but basically it doesn't address the part about the goat. It only talks about the first fruits and expounds on that a little bit. And a skim of some of the online commentaries, they were pretty much the same, that they only looked at parts of it like that, but I kept on looking. Now, I had one friend that suggested that there was 3 commentators in particular that they would trust with something like this. The 3 that they trusted were Barnes, Ellicott, and the Pulpit. And so I looked at what they had to say for each of the 3 verses. So first we'll look at Exodus 23:19. Now Barnes says, by the way, this is my note. Note he starts with analyzing the spring feast versus the fall feast, then references an idolatrous practice. Then he says, regarding the goat, and others take it in connection with the prohibitions to slaughter a cow and a calf, or a ewe and her lamb on the same day, Leviticus 22:28, or to take a bird along with her young in the nest, Deuteronomy 22:6. It is thus understood as a protest against cruelty and outraging the order of nature. Okay, then there's Ellicott, and I will note that he starts with analyzing the spring feast versus fall feasts, and then he references an idolatrous practice, and then he says, the best explanation of the passage is that of Bochart, that there was a sort of cruelty in making the milk of the mother intended for the kid's sustenance the means of its destruction. And then the Pulpit commentary, I'll read the full thing. It says, various explanations have been given of it, but none is satisfactory except that which views it as a protest against cruelty and outraging the order of nature, more especially that peculiarly sacred portion of nature's order, the tender relation between parent and child, mother and suckling. No doubt the practice existed. Kids were thought to be most palatable when boiled in milk, and the mother's milk was frequently the readiest to obtain. But in this way, the mother was made a sort of accomplice in the death of her child, which men were induced to kill on account of the flavor that her milk gave it. Reason has nothing to say against such a mode of preparing food, but feeling revolts from it, and the general sense of civilized mankind re-echoes the precept, which is capable of a wide application. Thou shalt not see the kind in his mother's milk. Okay, so now we'll look at the next verse, Exodus 24:36. So Barnes says, and by the way, I'm looking at these commentaries on Bible Hub. You can look at all of these 3 commentators by looking up the verse and the commentators there. Neither shall any man desire, etc., intended to encourage such as might fear the consequences of obeying the divine law and attending to their religious duties. Compare Proverbs 16:7. And so the REV, Proverbs 16:7 says, when Yahweh takes pleasure in a person's ways, even his enemies will make peace with him. Okay, Ellicott for this verse says the first of the first fruits, and then compare Exodus 23:19, thou shalt not see the kid. See note 3 on Exodus 23:19, which we did. The Pulpit on verse 26 says the same thing, repeated from Exodus 23:19. It is remarkable that both legislations terminate with the same somewhat strange proviso. There must have been an intention of impressing strongly upon the people the principle of tenderness involved with it. See the comment on Exodus 23:19. It seems like they're, stretching, a little bit, like it's an obligation to make a comment, anyway, so then we go to Deuteronomy 14:21, and Barnes, the notes only pertain to the top part of the verse. There was no reference to the goat for him on this one. For Ellicott, he says, thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. This is the last appearance of a command repeated twice in Exodus, and we looked at both of those. See the notes there. The Pulpit on verse 21 says, compare Leviticus 17:15, Exodus 23:19, Exodus 34:26. The stranger that is in thy gates, the uncircumcised stranger that is in thy cities, Targum, i.e. a heathen who takes upon him that he will serve no idol with the residue of the commandments which were commanded to the sons of Noah, but is not circumcised nor baptized. So he pretty much is commenting on the top part of the verse, but not the goat for that one. So I feel like although these are great educated scholars and they're very helpful many times, I'm just not sure that they really felt very comfortable about this. Now, that didn't stop me though. I kept digging, and then I ran into an article from the Jerusalem Post from April 6th of 2016 by Dror Den Ami. I'm going to refer to him as Dror as I go through this, and I may not be pronouncing that right. Forgive me, Dror Den Ami. Entitled "From Metaphors in the Torah: Cooking a Young Goat in Its Mother's Milk." So he starts, I'm going to be summarizing his article. It was a pretty long article, and I'll be picking out parts of it. And in some of them, I'll use 3 dots to show where I copied the whole paragraph, I clipped a little out here and there. But summarizing the article, his opening remarks are worth noting. In this series of articles appearing in the Jerusalem Post, I have tried to hammer home the point that food is a metaphor for knowledge, and specifically each type of food represents a certain type of knowledge. Sometimes the Tanakh comes right out and says that a certain tree or a certain food should be associated with a specific feeling or idea. For example, grapes are associated with happiness. Other times, no indication is given at all. Now, one thing that I'll say about him is that, he does go into like the Hebrew roots at times, and he doesn't list a whole lot of verses in there, but that's something that's okay. If I see something that gets my attention, I will start looking to see, does the Bible actually say that? So that's what I'll be doing today a lot. And that his approach in this section is to break the verse down into its elements. So the easy part is the don't. We all know that they all had don't, and that, but he's going to look at each of the other four elements separately. So as we go to this, in his article, he notes there's 4 elements to the commandment. There's the milk, the cooking, a goat, and the mother. And then he looks at each one individually. So first, when it comes to the milk, his notes show, okay, so the first element we shall discuss is milk. In previous articles, we have shown that based on a 2-letter root system used in ancient Hebrew, the Hebrew word for field, a female breast, and a spirit are all related. Thus, since a woman's breast produces milk, we can also say that a field produces a type of spiritual knowledge associated with milk. In other articles, we noted that even in modern times, the earth is used as a metaphor for a school. And in any university in the world, one can hear the question, what is your field of study? We went on to conclude that this interpretation was connected to the phrase, a land of milk and honey. We also pointed out that in the New Testament, the Pharisee Paul of Tarsus comes right out and says that milk is a metaphor for easy to understand spiritual teachings, and meat is a metaphor for difficult to understand religious teachings. In regards to the milk produced by the field breast, all we can say for sure is that it has something to do with spiritual teachings because of the common root already mentioned. In addition to this, we can also say that the milk of a woman's breast is very tasty, very sweet, and very easy to digest. What this then suggests is that the milk represents a spiritual knowledge which is agreeable to the listener and is not too difficult to understand. As mentioned in other articles, even in modern times, we still talk about digesting information found in a book or presentation. So, some of this might fit, some of this might go a little wide. For me, what I like to do is hold it up to the Word of God. So I looked at this a bit more. These are my notes. So he mentioned that milk is good, easy, good for the immature. I'd agree with that. 20 times in the Old Testament, you see the phrase milk and honey, and the context is always a land that will provide abundantly without much hard work. The cow does the work, the goat does the work, and the bees do the work for the honey. Some of the other 30 times that milk is mentioned, I'm going to go to Job chapter 21, and in verses 22 through 26, it says, Can anyone teach God knowledge, since he judges those who are on high? One dies in his full knowledge, being wholly at ease and quiet. His pails are full of milk. The marrow of his bones is moistened. Another dies in bitterness of soul and never tastes of good. They lie down alike in the dust. The worm covers them. So obviously the context of that has to do with, people dying, but there's a contrast between the person whose pails are full of milk and he's in full strength, and then the other one, dies in bitterness. So the milk is a good thing, and that it kind of shows the sustaining there. Isaiah 28:9 says, "To whom will he teach knowledge? To whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from the milk and just taken from the breasts." And so here it associates milk with, you teach a child in a different way. They learn, obviously they do, but you teach them a different way. And that you have this context of milk and a message and knowledge. Isaiah chapter 60 in verse 16, it says, "You will also drink the milk of the nations and will nurse from royal breasts, and you will know that I, Yahweh, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob." So the whole context of Isaiah 60 is kind of a future picture of the kingdom where Jesus Christ will reign, and that the whole world is going to be like climbing over each other to bring him gifts and good things and stuff like that. So the nations are going to come, and that they will bring, good things. Milk is associated with good things here. 1 Corinthians 3, chapter 3, verse 2 says, I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you were not able to receive it. No, even now you are not able. So here is what, consistent with what he was referencing, that the milk is the easier, knowledge to understand. And then we'll go to Hebrews chapter 5. And in verses 12 to 14, we read, "For indeed, being morally obligated to be teachers due to the length of time you have been taught, instead, you need someone to teach you again the rudiments of the beginning of the words of God. Indeed, you have become ones who need milk, not solid food. For everyone who partakes of milk is inexperienced in the word of righteousness, for he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, even those who through repeated use have their senses exercised to discern good and evil." So here you definitely see the association of milk being the more rudimentary teachings. And 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2 says, "Like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you grow up in your salvation." So I think that, his findings are somewhat consistent with milk having to do with teachings that are easy. Next, he goes to cooking, and these are his drawers notes again. And I've got those 3 dots that I've summarized parts. So the second part of the commandment has to do with cooking. Of the 3 stories we shall discuss here, 2 of them have to do with spices. The first reference noted that Potiphar, the man who bought Joseph when he arrived in Egypt, in Hebrew is described as a chef or a cook and not captain of the guards, which appears in most English translations. We also explained that Joseph arrived with a spice caravan, and that the Hebrew word for meat also means to preach. Our conclusion was that Potiphar took Joseph into his household as a spiritual advisor to help him prepare religious explanations for Pharaoh, i.e., to help spice up his religious sermons. Okay, possibly a little stretch there, but interesting, connections. The second story dealing with cooking has to do with Jacob preparing a red food for Esau and exchanging for his birthright as the firstborn son. Why this is important is that as a direct result of this story, Esau's descendants will be known as the Edomites, which means the red men. Also, Esau was a hunter, i.e., he chased after meat. Which should be considered is that somewhat surprisingly, the Torah says Esau returns home tired, and not hungry when he makes his deal with Jacob for food. So, but here we're definitely, showing that the cooking, there is some, altering going on with the food. We'll see that more. So I looked into this cooking to see what I would see in the word. And what I found was in Matthew chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. For they tie up burdens that are heavy and hard to carry, and they lay on them on people's shoulders, but they are unwilling to help move them with their finger, and they do all their works in order to be seen by people, for they widen their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels on their clothes. So Jesus is talking about the Pharisees here. And it seems that, you go to the Pharisees, they were the spiritual rulers for the children of Israel at the time. They were supposed to be the people that had the knowledge anyway, maybe not rulers, but they were supposed to be the experts, and people could go to them for information. But somehow or another, they were modifying it in a way that it wasn't really doable, and they were trying to make themselves look good. Matthew, also of chapter 23, verses 15 to 28, similar context. How terrible it will be for you, experts in the law and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel over the sea and the land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourselves, the garbage dump, son of the garbage dump. How terrible it will be for you, you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the sanctuary, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary, he is obligated by his oath. You no goods and blind men, for which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold holy? You also say, whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obligated by his oath. Blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift holy? Therefore, the one who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it, and the one who swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it, and the one who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one sitting on it. How terrible it will be for you, you experts in the law and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, which are justice and mercy and faithfulness. But it is necessary to do those things and not neglect the other. You blind guides who are straining out the gnat, but swallowing the camel. How terrible it will be for you, you experts in the law and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup so that the outside of it will be clean also. How terrible it will be for you, you experts in the law and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs that outwardly do indeed appear beautiful, but inwardly are full of dead people's bones and every kind of iniquity. In the same way, outwardly, you also appear righteous to people, but inwardly, you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Tell us how you feel, Jesus. He is very, very animated. When I read this section, that's what I get from it, that he's very upset that they really aren't getting it. And I looked a bit more on the cooking one because I felt that this was really, this really struck a chord with me. So summarizing, I'm going to go to these next two sections. I'm only going to summarize what they say because it's so many verses. But if you go to Matthew 5 and read verses 20 to through 44, this is the Sermon on the Mount. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with it. If not, I'd encourage you to go there. And what you'll notice in there is there's this pattern of, you've heard it said, but I say to you. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Where would you have heard it said? Probably from teachers that agree with each other. They're probably, taking part of it from the Bible, maybe all of it. But apparently there was something more, something that was better about it that he was explaining. And in Matthew 12, verses 1 through 24, again, a big section. That section covers where he was with his disciples gathering grain to eat in the field on the Sabbath. And it covers the healing of the withered hand on the Sabbath, and it covers the healing the blind and the mute man. And in all three of these cases, it was the Pharisees that confronted him. So one of the things that I really notice in all this, you'll see I spent a lot of time in Matthew here. It's not because I was looking for Matthew. It's because that's where the data led me. And that I really brought to my attention this verse in Deuteronomy. I'll read, this is chapter 17, and I'm going to read verses 14 and then 18 through 20. So 14 says, when you have come to the land that Yahweh your God gives you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. Mind you, at the time this was written, they did not have a king, but this is a prophecy that it's going to happen. But here, there's some instruction that goes with it, which there's a lot of instruction in Deuteronomy. In verse 18, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the Levitical priests, and it is to be with him, and he is to read from it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them, that his heart not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he prolongs his days in his kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. So the four gospels each depict Jesus in a different light. I've heard teachings to this effect, and I tend to agree with them. And that in the book of Matthew, you'll see the way that it's written, the context, the lineage, all of that stuff kind of points to a kingship. And that for Jesus Christ, I can only imagine that he recognized he was that Messiah. He was going to be sitting on a throne someday. He was going to be an appointed king at some point. If he did everything God told him to do, that was the game plan. It would not, there's nothing that is really written about his growing up between the ages of 12 and 30, except for that at age 12, he was in the temple, talking to the teachers and the experts in the law, and they were amazed at what this 12-year-old kid knew. And I can't help wondering, I mean, it was a big gap in time. I could be wrong, but I wonder if he might have done that, if he might have written out a copy. Can you imagine getting down with it would be so much easier with a pencil and paper, right? But writing out every single word of the 5 books of Moses, of all of the prophets, writing all of that down to have a copy for yourself. It wouldn't surprise me. That's all I'm saying. And the way that you see Jesus function, he goes to the scripture and he's so clear and so accurate with it. He spent some time with his head in the book. And I'm sure he at least read this verse, that's for sure. But in general, what I'm going to say about the cooking is cooking something changes it. And when it comes to God's word, that can happen. That so many times there may be some verse in there and somebody kind of goes off on a flyer. Hope I'm not doing that today. And that a lot of people go along with it. And I find that the best way to combat that is to go back to the Bible, to look at it in a fuller context and make sure that what you're speaking really does have to do with the word of the God. But you can see with the Pharisees, they did it a lot. So now we're going to get to the third thing, and this is the goat. And first we're going to look at his notes, Drawer's notes, and that, again, I've removed some parts for brevity. The third reference about cooking also introduces us to the third element of the commandment, which is the goat. Rebecca took a spicy or savory stew, but she cooked a spicy or savory stew, but she uses 2 goats. Why did Rebecca tell Jacob to bring goats and not lambs or calves? Why did Rebecca request 2 goats and not 1? To answer the first question, we must examine other stories about goats in both the Torah and the Tanakh. One of the most famous stories in the Torah is the betrayal of Joseph by his brothers and selling him into slavery. What is not appreciated is that the brothers, in order to convince their father that Joseph is dead, dip his robe into the blood of a goat. Hence, goat's blood in this story has something to do with deception. And we should keep in mind that God told Noah that the soul is in the blood. Another story dealing with a goat features the daughter-in-law of Judah that would be Tamar, deceiving him into thinking that she is a prostitute. Why this is worth noting is that we are told that Judah was on his way to shear his sheep. So one would think that a prostitute would have asked him for a lamb from his flock. Regardless, once again, the deception is involved, and in order to accomplish her goal, Tamar specifically asked for a goat. Actually, Judah offered the goat. I guess it depends on how you read it, maybe in the Hebrew, but again, continuing on. Finally, in the story of Rebekah convincing Jacob to steal Esau's blessing, the entire narrative is based on deception, and the goat has a double function. First, the goat is cooked in a special manner using spices to make Isaac think that it is some type of meat caught in the field. Second, the goat's hair is placed on Jacob's arms and shoulders because Esau is described as a man covered with hair as thick as a garment. Why Rebekah requested 2 goats and not 1? This is why I believe we are told that Esau is a hunter, i.e. runs after meat. Esau is associated with the field, which we said represents a school. This combined with chasing after meat suggests that Esau was intellectually curious and was interested in other people's cultures and religions. Thus, Esau is a man with red hair, which is described as being similar to goat's hair, and we have already touched upon the connection between hair and devotion. In Hebrew, the word for red also means man and ground. Thus, Esau is a man of the earth and not a spiritual man, since God traditionally is associated with the sky and heaven. In Hebrew, the word for sky and heaven are the same. Thus, Esau is devoted to the academic lifestyle based on the teachings of men. However, when compared with the teachings of God, these teachings of men are deceptive in their very nature because men don't know anything for sure. Well, if they know the word of God, they know something. But the point that he's making here is he's seeing deception connected with the goat, and his sources seem good. So I looked a bit more. This is what I noticed. Again, we're back in Matthew, right? Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 32 through 34, I'll read, and then 41. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to the ones on his right, "Come, you who have been blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that is prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Then he will also say to the ones on the left hand, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the fire in the age to come, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels." So here we see that the sheep are associated with blessing, with goodness, and that the goats are associated with sin that causes people to die an everlasting death, that the rejection of Jesus for sure. I mean, sin you can get resolved because of the work of Jesus, but if you reject Jesus, then you end up in Goat Town, and that results in fire. I'm going to summarize Leviticus 16 instead of reading all of it, although I will mention verse 21. The summary of Leviticus 16 gives details of the Feast of Atonement, and it describes 2 goats. One is to be killed as a sacrifice for a sin offering. The other, which they call for Azazel, is kept alive. So in verse 21, it talks about that. Aaron is to lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel and all their transgressions, even all their sins. And he is to put them on the head of the goat and is to send him away into the wilderness by the hand of a man appointed for the job. Jesus was appointed by God. In Acts chapter 10, verses 40 through 43, it says, But God raised him up the third day. We know who that's talking about, and granted that he should be seen, not by all the people, but by witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God, even to us who ate and drank with him after he rose from among the dead. And he commanded us to proclaim to the people and to solemnly testify that he is the one who has been appointed by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him that through his name, everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins. And taking away the sins, like the goat goes into the wilderness, all the sins of Israel are on the goat's head, and he goes in the wilderness and takes them away out of the camp. Jesus is said to take away sins. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28 says, so Christ also, having been offered one time to take away the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to atone for sin, but to save those who eagerly wait for him. And then in 1 John chapter 3, verse 5, it says, and you know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and there is no sin in him. So I would agree. I see the goat pointing to sin and deception, and also through the Feast of Atonement, it points to Jesus as appointed by God and taking sins away. So then we go to the fourth element, which is the mother. And I got a double, there we go. Dror's notes, his notes say, the fourth part of the commandment has to do with mothers. A mother is a metaphor for a spiritual medium. Eve was made from the bone of Adam's rib. The Hebrew word for bone shares the same two-letter root with the word for advisor. Furthermore, the rib bones produce blood, and we're already mentioned that God told Noah that the soul is in the blood. Finally, Adam said that Eve received her name because she is the mother of all living things. This is clearly a metaphor because Eve is not the mother of Adam, and she certainly wasn't the mother of the animals. The Hebrew name for Eve means alive, and even in modern times, there is a connection with a person's ability to understand and life. So we say a person is brain dead to suggest that they are stupid, and in fact, brain activity is the standard now used by hospitals to determine if a person is still living. These are his words. Thus, a mother is a metaphor for a source of spiritual understanding given to man by God. In other words, a mother is a spiritual intermediary. God said it was not good for Adam to be alone. God is always associated with the knowledge about what is good. Hence, the function of Eve as a spiritual intermediary was to help increase Adam's knowledge about God, but instead, initially, she helped increase his knowledge about the snake. So I went digging into this, and what I saw is the verse that he referenced regarding Eve was Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. Adam called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. Adam was attributed responsibility for the fall because he got the clear, correct, direct teaching right from God. But he would have communicated it to Eve, but apparently not as clearly and correctly. Somehow, whatever he gave to Eve, she wasn't as clear about it, so that when the adversary went after her, she couldn't really stand like she should have. Even so, her influence was enough to influence him to sin, that she then coaxed him into going her way, and he went with it. That was his choice, but he had the correct information in the first place. Next, we'll go to Judges, and in chapter 4, we're talking about Deborah, the judge in Israel, and in verses 4 and 5, it says, now Deborah, a woman who was a prophetess, so the Bible calls her a prophetess, she's a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, she was judging Israel at the time. She was sitting as judge under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went up to her for judgment. So people trusted what she said. The people of Israel, she's just under a tree. You've got the whole land and she's under a tree. And yet people all around know about her, that she's hearing from God. What she says is solid and they're going with it. Her influence is really carrying because she's giving good, in this case, good information, which is coming from God, and people are trusting her. And that there's a whole story about Sisera and his chariots of iron, and that they were oppressing Israel, and that Deborah got the revelation that helped them to put together a plan that ended up saving Israel at that point. And then comes the praise, right? And so in chapter 5, she has this God-inspired praise that she and the general of the army are praising God. And in Judges 5:7, it says, village life ceased in Israel. They ceased until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose a mother in Israel. She wasn't the mother of every single tribe, Naphtali, Issachar, Zebulun. She wasn't the mother of all of them. She was just from her one tribe. However, her words had influence that carried everywhere. So in this case, I would have to agree with them that the word mother can be associated with influence, with teaching, with instruction, with direction, giving people clarity. That I can see that from there. And in 2 Samuel, if you go to 2 Samuel chapter 20, I'm going to read verses 16 through 22. So in this, the story that we're looking at here, the context, right, is that David's king in Israel, and one of his good guys, there's these sons of Belial, definitely bad guys, that kill one of his good guys. And that David is like, oh, heck no, we're going after them. And so David's men, he tells his commander, go after this guy and take him out, right? So they follow this guy to the city, the bad guy. He runs into the city for protection. It's a gated city. It's a fortress. He'll be safe there. That's his plan. But David's men with Joab are coming after him. So then a wise woman cried out of the city, listen, please say to Joab, come near here and let me speak with you. So he came near to her. This is Joab, is David's guy, right? He came near to her, and the woman said, are you Joab? He answered, I am. Then she said to him, listen to the words of your servant. He answered, I'm listening. Then she spoke, saying, they used to say, yes, say, in former times. Let them ask, yes, ask, counsel at Abel. And so they ended the matter. I am among those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel? Why will you swallow up the inheritance of Yahweh? Joab answered, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. That is not how it is. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri, this is the bad guy, by name, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Give up him only, and I will go from the city. So the woman said to Joab, behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall. Then the woman went to all the people in her wisdom. They cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. He blew the shofar, and they disappeared from the city, every man to his tent, and Joab returned to Jerusalem the king. So this woman saved her whole village by using wisdom, but it refers to her as a mother. So I see wisdom there. And if you look at the book of Proverbs, that it associates a woman with wisdom a lot, Lady Wisdom. So I can see that too. And also, so then the next test as to what does this thing about the goat really mean is to look at the context where this is referenced, right? So in Exodus, when we get to chapter 23, verse 19, where it says, the best of the first fruits of your ground you are to bring into the house of Yahweh your God. You must not boil a goat in its mother's milk. So this was Moses' fourth time up Mount Sinai after leaving Egypt. And God was giving instruction regarding the feasts. And his instruction included that they were to bring their best. You see that? The best of the first fruits. Then in Exodus 34, verse 26, it says, you are to bring the first of the first fruits of your ground to the house of Yahweh your God. You must not boil a goat in its mother's milk. This was the 7th time up Mount Sinai after leaving Egypt. And God was giving instruction again to Moses about the feasts again. His instruction included that they were to bring the first of their first fruits. Now, I'm going to go a little bit personal here, and maybe you'll find it relatable, maybe not, but I think there's something to this. The first and the best. When I have people I love come to my house, or I'm cooking something for them, something like that, I'm making, let's say I'm poaching some eggs, right? And so I've got all the eggs in the pot and I pull out the first ones. They are cooked perfectly. And I set them, on their plate, however I'm making it. And then I go in for the second one. Okay, maybe that one's a little overcooked, or maybe the first one was undercooked. I don't know. But probably we'll say it was perfect. And the second one, the yolk breaks, whatever. And I go, I'll eat that one. That one's okay, right? It's like, the people you care about, you want to give them the best. Let's say you've got a, plant of strawberries, and, you're looking, they're not ripe. And then you start to see some of them getting some red color on them, and they're looking a little bit better, and you turn it over, not quite done yet, not quite done. And then you get that perfect strawberry, that plump one that's perfectly red everywhere. That's the one you want to share with people, right? The people that you care about, the people, you want to, that you give them the first and the best. I see these 2 verses that are talking about these feasts of Israel as being an opportunity to establish that relationship with God, to give him your best, to give him your first, to think about God right away and give him your very best. I see these 2 verses in Exodus as being people towards God, and that God is giving them the instruction to show them how to use their heart properly in that context. Then we go to Deuteronomy 14:21. You are not to eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the foreigner living among you who is inside your gates, so that he can eat of it. You may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to Yahweh your God. You must not boil a goat in its mother's milk. Now, this was during the wilderness wanderings, right? The 40 years. And God gave them a lot of instructions. And in this section, he's talking about food laws. And there's apparently no danger to eating this meat. However, God is setting a standard of quality here. So when I read this verse, and I never saw this before till this time, but what I'm seeing is like in Deuteronomy 14:21, this is God's relationship towards us. Like, trust me, I'm your God. I will provide for you. You are going to have enough meat. Go ahead and take the fresh meat, the best meat. That sheep that, fell into the creek and drowned itself and you couldn't get to it quick enough, it was probably a little bit scared when that happened. The meat might be just a little bitter. It's not going to kill anybody. It's not going to hurt anyone. It's safe. These people inside your gates, they're going to be just fine. But for you, I want something better. So go ahead, you can sell it to them, you can give it to them, you can let them have it, give them a 20% discount, whatever, that's okay. But trust me, I'm your God, I'm going to provide for you, and I want you to have something really great. That's what I see going on in Deuteronomy 14:21. I never saw that before, and maybe I'm not right, but that's how I'm seeing that. So the context of all 3 verses is instruction. There's specific detail, but it's clear. I mean, it might not be to me because I haven't really done a lot of animal sacrifices, okay, like none, but at least for the Israelites, they didn't have any questions. And Moses was right there to get clarity if he felt it was needed. You never read anything in the Bible where Aaron went to Moses and said, I don't know what you mean by that. No, when God gave Moses the detail, it was really clear. And it doesn't seem odd that he'd want them to not alter the simple, clear instruction with corrupted information. That's where I see us kind of getting to that, why would you, when you give someone a clear direction, you'd kind of like them to follow it. Why would you not want them to follow it? But if that's the case, why not just say it clearly? If I don't want you to alter the clear instruction, why not just say that? And I think we see a foreshadowing again, guess where? Matthew. And this time we'll go to Matthew chapter 13 and look at verses 10 through 17. And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered and said to them, "To you it is given to know the sacred secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, from him will be taken away even that which he has. That is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown fat, and their ears are dull of hearing, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would perceive with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return to God, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous people desired to see the things that you see and did not see them, and to hear the things that you hear and did not hear them. So, I kind of associate this with people that just go through the motions, and they feel like, well, I'm right by God. I do the thing, whatever the thing is that they feel like they need to do, and they do the thing, and, but their heart really isn't into it. That, do they really grow in that relationship? It's all about relationship. If you want to have a relationship with someone, you really share your heart with them, and you listen to the words that they have to say, and you find yourself caring about what they care about a lot of times, because that's what happens in relationships, that there's this deepness to it, and that when you just go through the motions, hey buddy, how's it going? You don't necessarily get that. And that if you really, really want to know God, I'd say really, really go to his word and really, really care. And you'll just be surprised how things get more and more clear. At least that's what it's been like for me. Like I told you, reading the Bible multiple times, it just keeps getting better and better. And there's one more thing I'm going to say about this. Why not just say it clearly? Anybody ever hang out with a toddler and tell them, don't touch the stove, it's hot, it'll hurt, that's an owie? How many people want to lay bets on how many toddlers will just go and touch the stove anyway? Not all of them, but yeah, I think there's a good number that will. That God could have just said, I'm giving you instruction, do what I say. How many people are gonna really, really get that? By phrasing it this way, it kind of draws you in, like it did me, right? It makes you think, why is that in there? And then you get to understanding that he wants us to dig. He wants us to know more. He wants us to get it. And what we saw with the Pharisees, right? They had the books, they had the scrolls, they had the information. Did they really, really care? If they would have, according to this stuff in Matthew 13, that God would have helped them understand it more clearly. But instead, they just kind of went through some of the motions, and that Jesus reprimanded them for that. Even though they were reprimanding him, that he went back to them with it. So there's one more thing, though, that when it comes to understanding, what do I believe or not believe when it comes to different things that I'm presented with and understanding the Bible, there's one more thing that I personally use to help me decide which is the better understanding. And that's what I call the fruit test. So the fruit test is, I look at what it is that I'm looking at and I start asking questions. Why is this in here? What's the benefit? I mean, if God has a book and he wants us to read it, there should be some benefit, right? Does it show me who God is? Does it validate the integrity of his word? Does it help me understand how God's spirit works? Oh, that would be helpful. Does it show me things about the Messiah and Jesus? Wow. I mean, you really get a very more and more clear picture the more Bible you read. Does it help me to love one another? Mark 12:28-31 says, what was the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Summarizing. And does it help me understand the enemy and his ways? That's helpful. Does it draw me in and get me hungry to know more? Yep, that's what this did. Does it give me hope for the future? Does it tell me about his kingdom that I'll get to be in? That's going to be pretty awesome. Does it help me understand how to apply his word in my life? Like, is it actionable? I think a lot of times it is. And does it build up and encourage? I see these things all over when I read the Bible. They show up everywhere. And when I see a verse that I don't understand, I think, does it do some of these things? And I've got 3 dots there because I think there's even more questions you could ask. You could build your own fruit test. So I'm going to look at this goat teaching in terms of the fruit test. What if we think that it's option 1? It's just cruel. It's against nature and the natural order. There's possible idolatry in there, right? What I see is, what about cows and their calves? Wouldn't that be, cruel too? How about ewes and lambs? Why does it only say goats? And that it can get to be kind of works-based when you're really, trying to execute on this. I had an aunt that cleaned houses in her youth for some people in a Jewish neighborhood that were very, trying their little hearts out to do the law. And they would have 2 refrigerators. Now, I've reading through the Bible 3 times, it's never caught my eye why someone would have 2 refrigerators, but I think this is the closest thing that brings them to that point. Maybe this is the reason, and that they want to keep the meat and the milk separate from each other. One refrigerator was for meat, the other was for milk products, but that ends up being kind of a lot of work. Like, if one of them breaks, does only that food get thrown out? Or, do you transfer the food from one side to the other? Can you even do that? It ends up, catching your focus that way. And it seems to have gotten expanded, right? Like the beyond simple and clear, like the beginning, it just said, don't boil a goat, right? But there's a lot of folks that, Jewish people that won't have a pizza that has sausage and, cow's cheese on it, right? Like those are, hamburger and goat cheese, right? Like it could be a different kind of meat and a different kind of milk, but they don't want the meat and milk together. Like they just don't want to take a chance at, deviating from the word of God. But I think that applying it that way is really expanding what the word actually says. And also, it can distance people from each other a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit. Like I go over to someone's house or to a party and they've prepared some foods that have both meat and cheese, and I'd have to say thanks, but no thanks. And not that that's a big deal. We end up having to do that for so many different reasons, but it ends up putting the focus on the food and not the people you're enjoying the food with. And that's where I kind of see the distance kicking in. I'm just not sure that I see the heart of God in that, but that's what I see with option 1. When I look at option 2 and I say that its application is don't alter with deception the simple instruction, these are the things that I see. Number 1, don't go beyond what the law says. Matthew 23:4 says, for they tie up burdens that are heavy and hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders. Don't go beyond. Just do what God asks you to do and get into that relationship, and don't lop on things and make it hard. I see a focus on getting saved. Romans 10:9-10 says, because if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord. Wow, talk about simple, clear instruction. And believe in your heart that God raised him from among the dead, you'll be saved. Talk about some serious gain there with some really simple instruction. For a person believes with the heart, resulting in righteousness, and a person confesses with the mouth, resulting in salvation. Bingo, that is like a monster, a huge, huge score. I see it being less complicated and actionable. When it says love one another, John 13:34, I am giving you a new commandment, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. That is less complicated. That's very actionable. And it's in a different place, it talks about on this, love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and mind and strength. That one's coming down, actually. We'll get back to that. I see it showcasing the goodness of God. In John 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, so that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have life in the age to come. Boy, if when you give, that's great. When you give something that really, really hurts, that gift is really worth noting, even more so, right? And that God gave the thing that would have hurt the very, very most, to have to see his son suffer that way. Even if he knew he was raising him up, which he did, just the same, to see the suffering, it's like, that was so, so bad. But he was willing to give that something that hard. It really showcases what God's all about. And it's complete, yet it's easy to understand and apply. When you use this, don't alter with deception the simple instruction, I see it as being complete and easy to understand and apply. This is what I was getting to before, Matthew 22:37-40. And he said to him, this is the lawyer that said, what's the greatest law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets. Don't worry about the goat. Don't worry about the milk. Don't worry about the 2 refrigerators. They didn't even have electricity in Israel. But don't worry about that stuff. If you do this love thing the way that God commands you to, all the law and the prophets hang on that. I think that I can really see that this is a very good understanding of what God's trying to get to there. Don't alter with deception the simple instruction. If we focus on the simple instruction, there's a lot of benefit in that. So here's the takeaways that I'd like to see people get from this teaching. The Bible is like a love letter. It helps you build a relationship. You want to know God? Go to the Bible. That's the book he wrote. He wrote it to you. You can learn more and more about it if you put some skin in the game. It's okay not to understand someone immediately. When you have a relationship, that happens. Stay in the game and work on it. It continues to build and solidify the relationship. When you continue to work at it, it gets better. Own what you believe. It's great to learn through the body. Jesus can work in anyone, but in the end, you are responsible for your own walk. Be patient in growing in your understanding. It's not always going to be clear, but keep at it. It gets better. And if you find something that's making it harder, question it. Go back to the simple teachings in the Word, in the Bible. Thank you for listening, and don't boil a goat in its mother's milk.